August 3, 2023, a warm summer evening in the peaceful suburbs of Austin, Texas. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the Carter household. Emily Carter, a lively 28-year-old school teacher, was sitting on the porch swing, sipping iced tea. Her husband, Michael, a 32-year-old software engineer, leaned against the railing, admiring the sight of his wife's glowing smile. The Carters were riding a wave of joy that had begun just 2 months earlier. In early June, Emily had discovered she was pregnant with their first child. It was a moment they had long hoped for but feared they might never experience. After years of trying to conceive, years filled with heartache, failed treatments, and dashed hopes, the positive test had been nothing short of a miracle. Emily remembered that day vividly. She had been feeling unusually fatigued and nauseous for a few weeks, chalking it up to the end-of-term stress at school. Michael, ever observant, had gently suggested she take a pregnancy test. Reluctantly, she did, mostly to prove him wrong. But when 2 pink lines appeared on the test, clear as day, her knees buckled. "Michael," she called out, her voice trembling. He rushed into the bathroom, worry etched on his face. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, she held up the test. His eyes widened as the realization hit him. We're having a baby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michael pulled her into a tight embrace, their joy spilling over in laughter and sobs. Now, in August, the initial shock and disbelief had given way to excitement and endless preparations. Emily's belly wasn't yet showing, but she felt the subtle changes in her body, the heightened sense of smell, the occasional wave of nausea, the gentle hum of anticipation growing within her. Michael had thrown himself into preparing for their new life as parents. He spent hours researching cribs, car seats, and baby monitors, creating detailed spreadsheets of their options. Emily teased him about his meticulous planning, but secretly, she loved how dedicated he was to their little family. That evening, as they celebrated the news with a quiet dinner on the porch, Emily looked over at Michael, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're going to be such a great dad," she said softly. Michael smiled, reaching for her hand. "And you're going to be the best mom," he replied. By early September, Emily and Michael had their first prenatal appointment. Nervous but excited, they entered the clinic hand in hand. Dr. Thompson, their kind and reassuring obstetrician, greeted them warmly. "Let's see how your little one is doing," she said, leading them to the ultrasound room. Emily lay back on the examination table, holding Michael's hand tightly as the gel was applied to her belly. Moments later, the rhythmic sound of a tiny heartbeat filled the room. Emily gasped, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the screen. "That's your baby," Dr. Thompson said, pointing to the flickering image. Michael stared in awe, his own eyes welling up. That's incredible," he whispered. The sound of their baby's heartbeat became a defining memory for the couple, a symbol of the life they had longed for and now cherished with every fiber of their being. By mid-January 2024, Emily's belly was rounded and prominent, her pregnancy impossible to miss. The nursery was nearly complete, painted a soft, sunny yellow and adorned with tiny star and moon decals, a theme they had chosen to represent hope and endless possibilities. On January 15, Emily and Michael attended their regular prenatal appointment. It had become a comforting routine, one they looked forward to with equal parts excitement and reassurance. Dr. Thompson's cheerful demeanor and positive updates always left them feeling at ease. "Everything is looking perfect," she said that day, showing them the latest ultrasound image. As they left the clinic, Michael's heart swelled with gratitude. He thought about how much their lives had changed in just a few short months. Everything felt like it was falling into place. Later that week, inspired by Emily's dedication to her health throughout her pregnancy, Michael decided to schedule a routine checkup for himself. He had always been healthy, but with the baby's arrival just weeks away, he wanted to ensure he was in the best possible shape to support his growing family. Trying to steal my thunder?" Emily teased when he told her about the appointment. "Guilty," Michael replied with a grin. "But seriously, I just want to make sure I'm ready for late nights and diaper duty." As he left for the clinic, Emily waved him off from the doorway, one hand resting on her belly. "Don't let them poke you with too many needles," she joked. "I'll survive," Michael called back, his tone light-hearted. But neither of them could have predicted that this routine checkup would soon cast a shadow over their picture-perfect lives. On January 18, 2024, Michael's world shattered. Sitting in the sterile, white-walled office of his doctor, he clutched the edge of his chair as the words sunk in. "Michael, your test results confirm you have a genetic condition that causes sterility. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you cannot biologically father children." The room seemed to spin. Michael's mind reeled with disbelief and confusion. How could this be possible? He had spent the last 8 months reveling in the joy of impending fatherhood, planning for late-night feedings, teaching his child to ride a bike, and being the dad he had always dreamed of becoming. Now, it felt like all of it, every hope, every dream, had been a lie. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," the doctor replied gently. "The condition is genetic, and there's no chance for error." "I wish I had better news." Michael left the clinic in a daze, the cold January air doing little to clear his head. By the time he arrived home, the confusion had turned to suspicion, and suspicion to anger. Emily was in the kitchen when Michael stormed in, his face pale and his eyes wild with fury. She turned to greet him, smiling softly as she placed a hand on her round belly. "You're home early," she said. "How was? Whose child is it, Emily?" Michael interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. Emily froze, her smile fading. "What?" Michael stepped closer, his jaw clenched. "Whose child is it? Don't lie to me. I know it's not mine." "Michael, what are you talking about?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "This is your baby. You're the only man I've ever been with. Don't play dumb," he spat. "I'm sterile, Emily. I can't have kids. The doctor confirmed it today. So explain to me how you're pregnant." Her face went pale. "Michael, no, there must be a mistake. This is your baby. I swear it." But Michael couldn't hear her over the roar of his own thoughts. Every moment of their shared happiness now felt like a cruel trick. "You cheated on me," he accused, his voice rising. "You lied to me, and now you expect me to raise another man's child." Emily backed away, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't cheat on you. Michael, please, you have to believe me. There has to be another explanation." "Enough," he roared. The rage that had been building inside him finally exploded. The neighbors heard Emily's screams through the thin walls of their East Austin home and quickly called 911. "There's something terrible happening next door," one elderly neighbor told the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "You have to send someone now." When the police arrived, they found Emily unconscious on the floor, her face swollen and bruised. Michael stood nearby, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. The officers immediately restrained him, handcuffing him as they questioned him. But Michael didn't respond, his expression dark and resolute. The paramedics rushed Emily to St. David's Medical Center, where doctors fought desperately to save both her and the baby. Hours later, the grim announcement came: they had been unable to save the baby. When Emily woke up the next day, the sterile white of the hospital ceiling greeted her. Pain radiated through her body, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness she felt in her soul. She reached instinctively for her belly, only to find it flat. Tears streamed down her face as the realization hit her. "Emily," a familiar voice said softly. She turned to see her brother, Ryan, standing at her bedside. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn expression that mirrored her own, he pulled a chair closer and sat down. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. "You're safe now." Her tears came in torrents as she tried to explain, but Ryan stopped her. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said, his voice steady. "Just rest. I'll take care of everything." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit holding cell, Michael sat alone. The cold, gray walls offered no comfort, but he didn't seek it. He stared blankly at the floor, his thoughts replaying the confrontation. Unlike the remorse others might feel, Michael's anger still burned hot. He felt no regret, only a deep, bitter sense of betrayal. "She lied to me," he muttered under his breath. "I gave her everything, and she threw it all away." A guard passing by glanced at him but said nothing. Michael barely noticed. To him, what he had done felt justified. He couldn't see the broken pieces of his actions for what they were. He couldn't see Emily's fear, her pain, or the life that had been lost. All he saw was his own version of the truth, a truth shaped by anger and pride. Back at the hospital, Emily clung to her brother's presence like a lifeline. As Ryan made arrangements for her to stay with him once she was discharged, Emily stared out the window, her heart heavy with grief. Her baby was gone. Her marriage was in ruins. The life she had built was shattered. On January 21, 2024, the trial of Michael Carter began in a packed Austin courtroom. The air inside was thick with tension as reporters, protesters, and concerned citizens crowded in to witness what many saw as a pivotal moment of justice, or injustice. Emily, unable to attend due to her physical and emotional condition, remained in the hospital, unaware of the storm brewing in her absence. Her brother, Daniel Hayes, sat in the front row, his face a mask of restrained anger and grief. The prosecution presented a harrowing case. They recounted the events of January 18 in vivid detail, Michael's discovery of his sterility, his subsequent confrontation with Emily, and the violent outburst that left her bruised and unconscious, resulting in the tragic loss of their unborn child. This was not a momentary lapse, the prosecutor argued, pacing before the jury. This was a brutal attack born of rage and entitlement. A man who claimed to love his wife took not only her safety but the life of their unborn child. Emily trusted him, and he betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Witnesses were called, including neighbors who described hearing Emily's screams that night. The prosecution also introduced medical records documenting the extent of Emily's injuries and the medical team's desperate, but ultimately futile, attempts to save the baby. The room fell silent when photos of Emily's battered face and the bloodied nursery were shown. Several jurors turned away, visibly disturbed. The defense, led by a sharp attorney hired by Michael's father, Judge Harold Carter, took a different approach. Michael Carter is a man who received devastating news mere hours before this tragic incident, the defense attorney began, his tone measured. A sterile diagnosis, which not only shattered his dreams of fatherhood but called into question the very foundation of his marriage. This was not premeditated violence. This was an emotional breakdown. The defense portrayed Michael as a victim of circumstance, a man driven to the edge by a cruel twist of fate. They emphasized his lack of prior criminal history, his deep regret, and his cooperation with authorities after the incident. Michael himself took the stand, his demeanor calm and rehearsed. "I lost control," he said, his voice wavering just enough to appear sincere. "I wish I could take it all back. I never meant to hurt Emily or the baby." But Daniel, watching from the gallery, clenched his fists. He could see through Michael's performance, but he could do nothing except hope the jury would, too. The verdict came swiftly. The jury found Michael guilty of assault and manslaughter. But when the sentence was announced, 6 months in prison and 2 years of probation, the courtroom erupted. Gasps of disbelief and cries of outrage filled the room. "This isn't justice!" Daniel shouted, leaping to his feet. Bailiffs moved quickly to escort him out as he yelled, "He killed my sister's baby, and you're letting him walk free." Outside the courthouse, protesters rallied, their signs demanding accountability. "Justice for Emily," they chanted as the Carter family exited the building under heavy security. Michael showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. To him, the sentence was a mere inconvenience, a brief interruption to a life he planned to reclaim. While Michael began his prison term, Emily's life unraveled further. Still in the hospital, Emily's physical wounds were healing, but the emotional trauma festered. At first, she was quiet, staring blankly out the window, refusing to talk about what had happened. But as the days passed, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. By early February, Emily began insisting that her baby was still alive. She clung to the belief that the doctors were lying to her, that her child had been taken from her and hidden somewhere. "They're out there," she told Daniel one day, her voice trembling with conviction. "I can feel it, Danny. My baby's alive." "Emily," Daniel said gently, taking her hand, "you know that's not true. The doctors. They're wrong," she snapped, pulling her hand away. "Why don't you believe me? You think I'm crazy, don't you?" Daniel's heart broke as he watched his sister dissolve into tears. He didn't know how to help her. By late February, Emily's delusions worsened. She began writing letters to imaginary people, begging them to return her child. She hoarded hospital supplies, believing she would need them to care for the baby when she found them. During one visit, Daniel found her packing a bag. "I need to leave," she said hurriedly. "They'll take the baby somewhere else if I don't find them now." "Emily, stop," Daniel said firmly, blocking her path. "You're not well. Please, let me help you." "I don't need help," she screamed. "I need my baby." On March 5, Daniel made the heart-wrenching decision to admit Emily to a psychiatric hospital in Dallas. It was the hardest choice he had ever made, but he knew it was the only way to keep her safe. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed Emily with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and psychosis. Her mind had fractured under the weight of her trauma, leaving her trapped in a reality shaped by grief and denial. Emily resisted treatment at first, refusing to accept the truth. During therapy sessions, she would speak of the baby as though they were alive, describing their laugh, their first steps, moments that had never happened. "They need me," she would say, her voice breaking. "I have to find them before it's too late." In April 2024, Daniel Hayes was consumed by a single thought: uncovering the truth. Determined to find closure, Daniel began digging through Emily's medical records. After weeks of navigating bureaucracy and pleading with hospital staff, he obtained access to a preserved DNA sample from Emily's prenatal tests. With the sample in hand, Daniel used a contact in a private lab to compare the DNA against a sample he had covertly obtained from Michael months earlier. The results arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. Daniel sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the email on his laptop. His heart raced as he opened the attachment and read the report. The DNA was a match. The child was Michael's. Later, Daniel looked up information about Michael's test that day, and as it turned out, the results were mixed up, and in fact Michael could always have children. The next day, Daniel learned that Michael had been released early for good behavior and had moved to a small apartment in San Antonio. Daniel's jaw tightened. The man who had caused so much pain, who had walked free after a mere 3 months in prison, was living a new life, untouched by the devastation he had left behind. Grabbing the DNA report, Daniel made his decision. Michael needed revenge for taking away Daniel's most precious possession, his family. Daniel drove to San Antonio. The hours passed in a blur, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his mind raced. By the time he arrived at Michael's apartment complex, his anger had settled into cold determination. Climbing the stairs to the second floor, Daniel found Michael's door and knocked firmly. It opened after a moment, revealing Michael in a casual t-shirt and jeans. His expression shifted from surprise to smug amusement as he recognized Daniel. "Well, if it isn't Emily's big brother," Michael said, leaning against the doorframe. "What brings you here?" Come to lecture me about how terrible I am. Daniel entered without waiting for an invitation, his eyes cold and focused. Do you know that your child died because of you? That's not true, I can't have children, she lied to me, Michael said confidently, although his voice wavered a little. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. She never lied to you. You ruined her life for nothing. For your own stupidity. Your results were mixed up that day, and this document proves that the child Emily lost was yours. Michael took the papers and began to read, his smile fading. Is that true? He asked. But Daniel didn't answer. He pulled the trigger. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the small apartment. Michael's body fell instantly, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Daniel Hayes sat in the quiet of Michael's apartment, the weight of what he had done settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Michael's lifeless body lay just feet away, and the acrid scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air. The crumpled DNA report, now slightly smeared with blood, was tucked into Daniel's pocket, a damning piece of evidence that had brought him to this moment. He picked up his phone and dialed 911, his hand steady. I've just shot and killed Michael Carter, Daniel said when the dispatcher answered. The address is 221 South Avenue, San Antonio. I'm surrendering myself. Send the police. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, but Daniel barely registered her words. He sat in a chair near the door, placing the gun on the table in front of him, and waited for the authorities to arrive. When the police entered the apartment minutes later, Daniel made no attempt to resist. He raised his hands, told them where to find the gun, and answered their questions without hesitation. He killed my sister's baby, Daniel said simply when an officer asked why he had done it. He destroyed her life. I couldn't let him get away with it. The trial began in October 2024, almost 6 months after Michael's death. By then, Daniel's story had gained national attention, sparking debates about justice, vengeance, and the morality of taking the law into one's own hands. In the courtroom, Daniel stood accused of second-degree murder. His defense attorney, a seasoned professional with a reputation for taking on difficult cases, worked tirelessly to present Daniel as a grieving brother pushed to his breaking point by a system that had failed him and his family. This is not the case of a man who acted out of malice, the attorney said during the trial's opening statements. This is the case of a man who was overwhelmed by grief, injustice, and the unbearable weight of his sister's suffering. Daniel Hayes is not a murderer. He is a man who sought justice in a world that denied it to him. The prosecution, however, painted a starkly different picture. Michael Carter served his time, the prosecutor said. He had faced justice as the law required. Daniel Hayes chose to become judge, jury, and executioner. No matter how sympathetic his motives may seem, his actions were unlawful and cannot be excused. Throughout the trial, Daniel remained composed. When he was called to the stand, he spoke with a calm but determined voice, addressing the jury and the court with raw honesty. I lost my niece and my sister to Michael Carter's violence and arrogance, he said. I watched as the system let him walk free after just 3 months in prison, while my sister was left in a mental hospital, broken beyond repair. I couldn't let him live his life as if nothing had happened. I don't regret defending my family's honor. His words divided the courtroom. Some members of the jury appeared visibly moved, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Public opinion outside the courthouse was just as divided. Supporters of Daniel's actions rallied outside with signs reading, "Justice for Emily," and "Daniel Hayes, a hero." Meanwhile, others condemned him as a vigilante who had undermined the very principles of justice he claimed to defend. The jury deliberated for 3 long days. On October 25, 2024, they returned with a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the complex nature of the case and Daniel's lack of prior criminal history, handed down a relatively lenient sentence, 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. The decision sparked further controversy. Supporters of Daniel argued that his actions, while extreme, were a response to a justice system that had failed his family. Critics, however, maintained that he had acted out of vengeance, not justice, and that his sentence was far too lenient for taking a life. Meanwhile, Emily remained in the psychiatric hospital, unable to escape the grip of her trauma. She had been informed of Michael's death, but the news barely registered. To her, Michael was no longer the man who had destroyed her life, he was simply another figure in the chaotic blur of her mind, a shadow overshadowed by the loss of her child. Her days were spent in a haze of delusion and longing. She spoke often of her baby, imagining them growing up somewhere far away, waiting for her to find them. Therapy sessions brought little progress, as Emily resisted any attempts to confront the reality of her loss. Daniel's visits became less frequent after his sentencing, but he wrote to her often. His letters were filled with apologies, reassurances, and memories of happier times, but Emily rarely responded. The brother who had fought so fiercely for her honor now sat behind bars, his life forever altered by his decision to take justice into his own hands.